So now let's dive a little bit deeper into the ego and how can we actually liberate ourselves through a better understanding of what it is and what its purpose is. Okay, so what is the ego? When we hear the word ego, we usually connect it with probably some type of negative meaning. Maybe not always, but more oftentimes than not. Sometimes it's associated with those qualities of like pride or selfishness, arrogance, that sort of thing. But it's really become a widespread belief that it's something that even spiritually, like you need to get rid of the ego, right? Otherwise your spiritual development wouldn't be even impossible. You want to get rid of it. And the reality is the ego really is just nothing more. It's just a term that really has to do with your self-identification. In other words, the ego is part of your personality, right? It's a part of your personality that you consider yourself. And there's nothing wrong with that, but there's just two types or two kinds of ego, I should say, right? We can think of it as the false ego or the true ego. It's because it's how you identify yourself with or what you identify yourself with. The ego is created as a function of the psyche at the human level of evolution. And it's necessary because it also provides us with the ability to be able to perceive the experience, right? It allows us to be able to experience the temporal reflected material world we talked about, the 3D world, right? But it's the false ego that gets us too attached to all the things of the 3D world at the physical level, at the emotional level, and at the mental body level as well, too. So that's really the problem, is the false ego and its attachments and how it starts to behave based upon that. Remember, the ego is part of our astral body, right? And this is what usually people call the soul, right? So there's a lot of confusion. We'll talk about this a little bit more too later about the difference between the soul and the spirit and that sort of thing. But when we talk about the ego, the astral body, it's attached to the soul, and the soul is what's immortal, right? Spirit is immortal, but the soul is actually mortal. And because of its own mortality, it lives in the perpetual state of fear of its own death, which again is part of the initial core programming to stay alive, right? So it's constantly assessing and making judgments and assessing risk and acting out with and taking on new beliefs and ideas based on what it considers to be threatening its own survival, okay? So the false ego is the identification of your essence with your physical body. That's what it really comes down to. The more you identify with just your physical body, the more the false ego has control over you. And all of its inherent desires and needs with something that is temporary, something that is mortal, right? The false ego causes attachments to all of the events and sensations of the material world, right? The people, the material possessions, all of these things provokes all kinds of fears of what? Of losing them, right? You think you need all these different things, and then you're afraid to be able to lose them, and then you do everything you desperately can to be able to hold on to them. This is the false ego. And this is where the 7 deadly sins of greed, gluttony, pride, lust, envy, anger, and laziness come from. That's the original purpose behind all of these things. Each one of them represent a certain type of attachment to the temporal 3D world, okay? Now, none of us have reached that state of perfection as of yet, which means we all still fall victim to variations of these attachments. None of us are perfect. And the goal here for mentioning this isn't to shame ourselves for any of the behavior, but simply to become more aware, right? The goal is to become more spiritually mature about what these attachments actually lead to, right? We don't want to be delusional in our thinking. There's nothing wrong with understanding like, okay, I have an attachment to this, I have an attachment to that. I'm not delusional about it. This is something I still need to work on. But some people sometimes, are delusional and don't realize that they still have a long ways to be able to go. So we mention all of this so that we can at least be aware, right? You want to be aware of where you actually are. And in fact, if you're not even interested, if I'm talking to somebody, if they're not interested in consciously participating in their own spiritual awakening and ascension process, then none of this really matters. If they're out there participating in all these things and they think their life is fine, then who am I to be able to say anything about it, right? Now, if they're suffering, and they come to me asking, for assistance in that, then I might say something else. But hey, if they're living their life and they're living their best life and everything's good and they don't see anything wrong with it, and that's where they are on their journey, and it's probably just best to leave them alone and let them carry on their own journey, right? But I've seen a lot of new spiritual influencers that really aren't teaching anything that has to do with ascension or aligning with our higher selves. It's really about just hacking the metaphysical laws in such a manner that they can indulge even more material excess, right? Essentially, what they're doing is kind of termed, in some areas it's called like the left-hand path of magic, right? Or sorcery. And all of this usually ultimately leads to self-destruction and that sort of thing, right? And of course, if everyone, is really on their own spiritual journey, so it's not about, judging. It's not our job to judge. But again, through spiritual maturity, you should be able to understand this, right? So if you are just using all of these different metaphysical laws to be able to just try to, get more stuff, accomplish more things, and rule the world, then that's something entirely different, right? And again, there's a lot of teachers that are talking about that, but that's entirely different than being on the path towards enlightenment, being on the path of trying to connect with your higher self and align your will with the divine will of divine source or God, right? So if you want to participate in your own ascension process, at some point you have to address any of these destructive attachments that you've developed that have contributed to your false ego and finally begin that healing process. That's what is really important. So it's under the influence of the false ego that there's this term egoism that you might have heard is really formed, right? And the term egoism just implies the magnitude of false ego and the degree of influence on your life. So what I mean by that is the stronger your false ego is, then it's like you are in this egoistic type way of living your life, right? And some spiritual teachings that are really focused on just material abundance and the indulgence in the form, you could say that is a form of egoism, right? So maybe you could call that spiritual egoism, where someone realizes that they're the I, it's just them, right? And their life position is just really taken to the point where they're just interested in personal satisfaction, right? And their personal interests are put above everything else, right? So a true egoist would do anything without considering the interests or the needs of other people. Now, most of us aren't really that extreme, and there might be the truth is it's probably some variation of that, right? That's the honest truth, right? And there's usually two main ways this manifests on a smaller scale that is part of the false ego. And that's first when that first kind of way of doing it, which is more extreme, which is where we just purely are out for ourselves. We talked about that already. You're just living for yourself. You don't really care. You're just trying to, you're out there to just get mine, and that's all it is, right? And much of the world is actually operating at this level, and that's why the old world really needs to die and birth a new one, right? Because we have a lot of these issues, especially within the United States, where it's founded on capitalism and all of these different things. But and it served its time for a certain period of time, but it also has a lot of issues, right? Because it also spawns a lot of this egoist type mentality where it is all about, winners and losers, right? So it is the place where you can make all your dreams come true if you're willing to just do whatever it takes to be able to, to make it happen and win, right? At the expense of anybody and everything else, unfortunately, which is what happens more times than not, right? So it's something we need to be aware of. The second form is when we live for the sake of who we're connected to. And this is more common. Most of us usually have this issue, which is ultimately just still about us, right? But it manifests in a way where it is identifying everything as ours, right? So you're like extra focused on my family, my children, my friends, my career, my home, my country, that sort of thing. And to some degree, obviously, if you have children, you're going to need to prioritize them over probably somebody else's children, right? So I don't mention all of these different things so that you just put them at the same exact level, but it's something for you to pay attention to because it is the beginning of how the false ego begins to step by step formulate beliefs, right? Where you don't really care, right? As long as it doesn't affect me, my family, my children, my country, or whatever I'm doing, then I don't really care. And that becomes dangerous, right? That is definitely not the path to love, which again, remember, is unity, greater and greater unity and understanding, which requires greater empathy, right? Greater compassion, that sort of thing. So when you're thinking about my family, it is also in conjunction to like, hey, how will this affect other people's families too, right? Maybe it's not just my family here, other families in other countries. It is expanding your awareness to be able to include all of these other different things instead of just me, starting to include we, right? And when we label someone or someone as mine, we start to declare to the world that we value and respect that one thing that you consider yours more than anyone else, right? You hear a lot of talk, and this could be controversial to a lot of different people. A lot of talk about like different countries, like America first, or it could be another country first. Maybe you're in the UK, and it's, hey, we need to think about what we're doing here first. And again, it's not, this is where it gets nuanced. It's not that there's something wrong with thinking about those things, but when it becomes imbalanced to the point where it is at the expense of everyone else, now it has become destructive. And that is why you're seeing the end of something that's happening right now, the end of an epoch of time where this kind of attitude was really the norm. And we're going to move into an entirely new way of living over the next 20 years. You'll see this new global civilization begin to be able to manifest where that will no longer be allowed, right? And this is just part of the evolution of the cycles of time, right? So all of that, we love our country more than somebody else. We respect our traditions more than anyone else. All of these things create those boundaries between, me and somebody else. And that is a problem. That is an imbalance, right? And I mention all this because it's about evolution. So as we're going through this cyclical cycle of yugas, during Kali Yuga, that may be okay. Things are so dark and there's so many other issues that were going on that was like, hey, that is actually not, the worst thing that is happening right now. There's so many other problems that's probably the best solution for this stage of evolution of life, right? But as we continue to progress and to evolve, we're maturing as a humanity, and we need to start increasing the awareness, and this level of unification and thinking of others also needs to increase at the same time. So this is what's taken place. The false ego will help keep us stuck, right, in this type of mentality, right, where we're constantly thinking about me, and not thinking about everybody else, right? So this is something we want to be mindful of. Okay, so I mentioned this again before, and I'm going to mention it again here now. The true ego is our immaterial self, our immortal self, our spirit, right? The true ego, not the false ego. True egoism, right, means living for higher goals, your spiritual purpose, helping others, loving unconditionally, and serving God and others without developing a true love for divine source or divinity or God, whatever you want to call it. It's impossible to awaken to true self because you're constantly identifying with something smaller, right? So when you awaken to the true ego, we become much more selfless. We start following the divine law and living for the benefit of all living beings, okay? Now, this doesn't mean that you're going to have, you can't have any goals anymore, or you should serve in a manner that neglects any of your own personal boundaries or anything like that, right? Or neglect your true needs of anything on the physical, mental, and emotional level. You still need to take care of all your needs. Your goals are just simply more aligned with your higher self. And the motive is less fixated on personal interests, I, me, and all of these things, because you're running too much off of the fear program, right? And you start living in harmony more with your true ego and higher self, right? You become more ethical, right? So your motives change. Our actions are no longer something that cause suffering to others. We're thinking about others at the same time. We no longer commit to violence of any kind. And we tend to want to cooperate honestly with people, right? Taking into account the interests of all that with whom we interact with, no desire to try and manipulate people whatsoever, okay? This is the signs of and the qualities of the true ego, the immortal self, our spirit. And we want to gain the qualities of something that is eternal, not temporary, right? Jesus or Yeshua, as he's called as well. The true purpose of him and his work here, right, was not so that he could come here and just everybody could just run in this false egoistic way and then save you, through your sins through belief in him. No, he was an example. He was there to set an example. So the best thing that you can do and honor his work is to try to express yourself and to express and take on the characteristics that he had. He was a living example, an expression of the immortal self, of the spirit, right? That's why he said, me and the Father are one, because I express the same will as the divine will of the higher self, the divine source. That is your goal. That's what you want to be able to accomplish. So the true ego is again immaterial and immortal. I've created a chart here that just starts to describe some of these characteristics, right? Provides some of the characteristics you find as part of the true self, and we have it stacked up against the false self. So you can see how when you're aligned with your true self, that your higher self is really the identifying as spirit, right? And you have more of this multi-dimensional awareness of all things. We talked about how that encapsulates everything, right? The true self senses unity with all things because of that. And while the false self feels the need to compete for all these limited resources because it's constantly thinking it doesn't have enough, right? That's the difference. The true self is humble. The false self loves to boast and brag about different things, right? And obviously the higher self walks a spiritual path as opposed to a material one. It's completely different. Your higher self is present while the higher self is really more present while it goes, the false self is fixated on the past and the future, right? The true self is generous while the false ego is greedy. One of the biggest characteristics of the awakened true self, right, or the higher self, is the ability to be able to recognize and take personal responsibility. That is one of the biggest signs of maturity and spiritual maturity. The false ego loves to blame others and express that victim mentality. Now, one of the key aspects of aligning with your true higher self is authenticity, right? That's another big one. And this isn't always as easy as it seems because the false ego will love to do everything in its power to project that false identity of authentic behavior. And unfortunately, this happens quite a bit within the spiritual community. Let me drink of water. Excuse me. Okay, so I see this happening a lot in the spiritual community, and it's often referred to as even spiritual bypassing, right? And this is where the false ego pretends to be more enlightened or awakened than it really is. And it uses all the same manipulative techniques it previously used, but now masks it behind spiritual terminology. You have to be really committed to be honest, right? During your introspection work, your shadow work, which only comes about if you're truly dedicated to your spiritual growth, right? I've seen, countless numbers of people who, they've gotten into spirituality and they think that they've reached these high levels of spiritual attainment and love to be able to just talk down to other people who maybe don't know all the different spiritual terminology. Maybe they don't understand all these different things and the metaphysical laws and whatnot. But on a maturity level, spiritual maturity, they've dealt with far more of the emotional issues than the other person who understands, spiritual terminology, right? So you have to keep that in mind in all of this work that we're doing, right? It's just because you understand the concept of unity and oneness doesn't mean you've integrated any of that into the mental, emotional, and physical body, right? The false ego wants to feel special. It loves to feel special because it's a form of protection, right? So it's easy to be like, oh, I'm spiritual now. I'm spiritually awakened. And look at all these other people. I'm special now, right? Spiritual teachers love to be able to do this. And they put a big emphasis on the fact that, there's some type of reincarnation as well. And this provides that purpose of that they are, incredibly special, more special than anybody. And whenever I hear that, like I'm a reincarnation of this person, I'm a reincarnation of that, it's a really big red flag to me that they're teaching from the spiritual false ego, right? And it doesn't mean that can't happen. Of course, there's reincarnation. Maybe there is somebody who's teaching and they were the reincarnation of somebody. But honestly, if you're operating from the true spiritual ego, right, it wouldn't even matter. There'd be no need to be able to mention that, right? Your teachings would be authentic enough to where you could express it and people would recognize the truth behind what you're saying without needing to be able to add all the additional context of saying I'm the incarnation of this or that person, right? So that's a really big red flag. And more, and they're probably just interested in followers, right? The second you hear that, they're more interested in gaining followers than they're actually interested in your actual spiritual growth. And you as a spiritual seeker, somebody committed to your ascension process, this is what you should be focusing on, right? And a great way to measure where you actually are is to simply take a good hard look at your own life, right? Do you actually live a life that's reflective of the spiritual awareness you believe you have, right? Okay. Do you? You just have to be honest and take a really good look at it. Just like, physical pain is an indication of imbalance, right, in the physical body, so is emotional pain and mental suffering, okay? So remember, personal responsibility is the key. So if your current life doesn't reflect the reality of spiritual awareness you believe you have, that's a good indication you have more work to do. And, you might be surprised by some unresolved issues that you still need to work on, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. Spiritual maturity is about taking responsibility and being truthful about where you really are and taking the time to be able to work on yourself and develop step by step, right? And depending on how severe The trauma is, right? Many of us have gone through things that are quite traumatic, right? Don't be afraid to go ahead and get professional help. We need as much help as we possibly can. And with SOLANCHA, we're providing a lot of different tools, spiritual tools, energetic tools, meditative tools, and different things like that. But don't let that stop you from getting professional help as well, right? There is sometimes these things are just so strong. We need something immediately, right, to be able to help us deal with it while we continue working on these other different practices. So it's incredibly important to be able to keep that in mind, okay? Okay, so with all that being said, how do we actually get rid of the false ego? You'll learn in the upcoming SOLANCHA course that the path of So is actually a path of liberation. We use this to be able to do quite a bit of the healing, right? As part of spiritual psychology. The true essence of liberation is to just identify oneself from that false ego and begin identifying yourself with the true self. And the process of overcoming that false ego is a daily practice that really happens every part of your life. It's something that happens step by step, integrating a little bit more, and a little bit more, right? And there's many things that you can do to be able to do that. And honestly, it also requires some additional meditative and energetic practices if you really want to speed up the process, because without that, it's really just, it's psychology. You're dealing with a lot of the same psychological transformative tools that have existed and continue to build exist, which are all really great, but it is going to be a slower process. If you combine that with actual energetic exercises based on the metaphysical laws and tools and understanding of the framework of how all of our bodies are made up of, the different levels of mind and all of that, and how you can tap into those things energetically, it'll really speed up the process, right? But there are some simple practices that you can do even today to be able to help begin this process of paying attention and liberating yourself from the false ego. And it's really just, learning about how to accept, right? Developing acceptance, being of more service, learning to trust more, really trying to gain the quality, the characteristic of modesty, and learning constructive self-detachment, okay? So what do I mean by those things? Acceptance really is just the ability to see the teacher in every person, right? It doesn't mean I need to accept all this bad behavior and just allow the abuse and that sort of thing. No, that's not what it means, but it does mean that you're able to see the deeper meaning behind why you might be experiencing something. And you can do that by seeing the teacher in every person, right? And that'll help you to be able to accept things that are happening to you that you might be struggling with. Service is just the ability to be able to see God in every person, right? Serving people the way you would see God. If everything is consciousness, if all of consciousness is trying to evolve, then you can see that, right? And again, it doesn't mean doing that at the expense of your own personal boundaries or that sort of thing, right? But you're operating from that level of awareness that you want to be of service. So when the opportunities are there, you take advantage of it and you do that. And that's where you're operating from. Trust just means that you stop trying to control everything and everyone, right? That's a behavior that is really trying to control because of fear, right? You think if you control everything that, you won't be surprised at everything and you'll stay safer, right? You won't be able to, and that's on the mental, emotional, and physical level, right? If you learn to build a trust, doesn't mean you shouldn't plan, doesn't mean that you should do your best to try and do things, but it does mean that no matter what, you know that the outcome is going to serve you in some type of way. And you may not even understand it as of yet, right? But that outcome is part of the divine plan and ultimately will serve you in a way that will help you develop, okay? Now, modesty or humility is just a normal quality that you should try to develop that's opposite to pride, one of those, deadly 7 sins, right? And that just means removing any desire for self-importance. Okay. That's why I mentioned the whole thing about like trying to be important and I'm special and that sort of thing. And you are special to a certain degree, but everybody is special, right? And just removing that desire to be special, understanding that, hey, I'm a part of consciousness. I'm a part of the process of evolution, and I'm here to be able to serve and align my will with the will of God or source is a great way to be able to maintain this level of awareness, okay? And then finally, maintaining a kind of constructive self-detachment from things. And that just means try not to take things personally. People's words and actions are usually directed at our false egos, right? Not our true self. It's all about our false ego. And so when there's no false ego, or the smaller your false ego is, then there's far less to be able to trigger us with. Right? So keeping that in mind, don't take it personal. If you're taking it personal, that is a clear sign you're probably identifying with the false ego quite a bit. And that's an opportunity for you to be able to look at it clearly and dissect that and figure out what's going on, right? So this whole study of spiritual psychology is quite vast, right? There's a lot to it. And the healing process takes time. It's a step by step level of integration, right? So you're constantly going through these different things. But it is something that we can all begin. These 5 things are just something small that just increase our awareness that we can do immediately, right? That will help shrink and start to take some of our power back from the false ego. And then, like I said, again, if you're participating in SOLANCHA and doing the courses and all of that, we're going to teach you how to specifically work with the energetic signatures of some of these emotions at the unconscious level, at the subconscious level, right? And how you can tap into them, not just on a psychological level, but on an energetic level and tangibly be able to sense them and be able to neutralize them, right? So utilizing all these tools will be a way to be able to quicken this process for you.